The role of power in global health policy. In this session, we will define power, compare different types of power, explain the relationship between power and global governance, and last but not least, identify various sources of power. So we come to the first question, what is power? Two of the most famous theorists of power, Barak and Beres, find that the concept of power remains elusive. For Dow, power seems nothing more than a giant globe of oily ambiguity. The assessment is very much in line with that of other political theorists. According to Morris, the meaning of the word power seems like a will-o script. It tends to dissolve entirely whether we look at it closely. We are sure that we mean something by the word and have a vague idea what it is. But this understanding tends to fade away upon examination. However, if we want to empirically study and conceptually explain variation in power, we need to have a clear understanding what we mean by it. You will have noticed how contested and unclear the concept of power is also in the readings for this session. Different authors use different definitions of power and distinguish between different types of power. I will now introduce you to some of the most influential definitions of power that have been used in the literature. Max Weber, a famous German sociologist, defines power as the probability that an actor would be in a position to carry out his own will despite resistance. Robert Dow explains, my intuitive idea of power is something like this. A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. Weber and Dow are two of the most important theorists of power. Their understanding of power has, however, been criticized as being too narrow. Critics have argued that Weber and Dow focus on the most visible aspects of power only, namely situations when the actions of one person or group have a direct impact on the actions of another, or when they directly influence a decision. According to Siriam, in his latest definition, is power best understood as power over one's influence over others, or power to one's capacity to achieve our goals? And how do we reconcile the power of underlying social structures in shaping individual behavior with human agency in determining behavior, thoughts, and action? One of the most famous critiques came from the political scientist Stephen Lewis. His principal argument is that we need to think about power broadly and pay attention to aspects of power that are less observable. In order to capture less observable forms of power, he suggests we distinguish between three phases of power. Firstly, the ability to influence decision, which is similar to the definitions proposed by Weber and Dow. Secondly, the ability to influence non-decisions, which issues appear on the decision-making agenda, and importantly, which issues are not discussed. And thirdly, the ability to shape people's perceptions, cognitions, and preferences in such a way that they accept their role in existing order of things. In other words, the third dimension of power Luke describes is the ability to shape people's identity. Barnett and Dufour take a similar stance. They argue that the analysis of power must include a consideration of normative structures and discourses that generate differential social capacities for actors to define and pursue their interests and ideals. They define power as the production in and through social relations of effects that shape the capacities of actors to determine their own circumstances and fate. Depending on the character that the social relations take through which power is exercised, be it direct or diffuse, interactive or constitutive, the taxonomy suggested by Barnett and Dufour distinguishes between four forms of power: compulsory power, institutional power, structural one, and productive power. Before we think about different forms of power in more detail and consider some empirical examples, let's briefly consider the relationship between power and global governance. In the lecture on global health governance, we learned that governance arrangements at the global level have largely been response to increasing globalization. More precisely, we learned that the compression of social space through people moving about ever faster and ever more frequently, and modern information and communication technologies making it possible for people to know about events in faraway places, and that these developments created a demand for better coordination and management of policies beyond the level of the nation state. Indeed, most studies on that subject emphasize the coordination function of global governance. This is apparent already if we look at some definitions of global governance. The definition we use in the lecture on global health governance is the actions and means adopted by a society to promote collective action and deliver collective solutions in pursuit of common goals. The Commission on Global Governance in 1995 defined global governance as the sum of the many ways individuals and institutions, public and private, manage their common affairs. It is the continuing process through which conflict of diverse interests may be accommodated and cooperative action may be taken. Oren Young, a famous scholar on global environmental governance, defined global governance as the establishment and operation of social institutions capable of resolving conflicts, facilitating cooperation, or more generally alleviating collective action problems in a world of interdependent actors. In all those definitions, the emphasis is on the facilitation of cooperation and the promotion of collective action. The underlying assumption is that in a world in which people, states, and companies are increasingly interdependent, the most important function of governance is to facilitate cooperation. While there is a recognition that different social groups and different states may have different interests, the assumption is that those conflicts of interest can be resolved if there are just the right mechanisms to pursue the goals that we all must have in common, such as maintaining peace, security, stability, environmental protection, and public health, for instance. The emphasis on global governance as the facilitator of collective action marks, however, that global institutions and policies are not neutral facilitators of cooperation and not merely a functional response to the demands of globalization. Rather, global institutions and politics reflect the varying abilities of different social groups and different states to represent their interests in global politics. Global governance is shaped by those states and interest groups that have the greatest power to influence which issues are discussed and which solutions are designed and accepted. To illustrate this, take a quick look at the graph here. Global institutions and policies reflect the varying abilities of different social groups and different states to represent their interests in global politics. Global governance is shaped by those states and interest groups that have the greatest power to influence which issues are discussed and which solutions are designed and accepted. Let's go through different types of power one by one. Compulsory power exists in the direct control by one actor over the conditions of existence and/or the actions of another. Some of the most famous and widely used definitions of power fall under this concept. Max Weber defined power, as we see, as the probability of one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his own will despite resistance, regardless of the basis on which this probability exists. Sheer influence can be reflected in Robert Dawes' earliest formulation. We see in previous line, power is the ability of A to get B to do what B otherwise would not do. Dawes' concept has three defining features. 1. There is intentionally on A. 2. There must be a conflict of desires to the extent that B now feels compelled to alter its behavior. And 3. A is successful because it has material and ideational resources at its disposal which drives B for the action. Compulsory power is an important form of power in international politics and global governance. Power in international relations is how one state is able to use material resources to advance its interests in direct opposition to the interests of another state. The great powers can determine the content and direction of global governance by using their decisive material advantages, not only to determine what are the areas to be governed, but also to directly coordinate the action of lesser powers so that they align with their interests. Multinational corporations can use the control over capital to shape the foreign economic policies of small states and global economic policies. International organizations also exhibit compulsory power. The World Bank can shape the development policy of borrowing states. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees can shape the life chances of refugees and other displaced people. Compulsory power is not limited to material resources and also includes symbolic and normative resources. transnational activists, civil society organizations, and international non-governmental organizations have demonstrated their ability to use rhetorical and symbolic tools and shaming tactics to get specific target states, multinational corporations, and others to comply with the values and norms that they advance. Various transnational activists successfully used symbolic means to press the Clinton administration to sign the landmine treaty. Activists have formed associations and deployed branding and certification techniques to try to use consumer power to compel producers to comply with labor, environmental, and human rights standards. The most powerful states can directly use economic institutions to their advantage and against the interests of others. Less powerful members of the Security Council can use legal norms to constrain the actions of the powerful. International organizations are able to use their expert, moral, delegated, and rational legal authority as a resource to compel state and non-state actors to change their behavior. Institutional power exists in actors' indirect control over the conditions of action of socially distant others. One works through the rules and procedures that define those institutions, guides, steers, and constrains the actions, or non-actions, and conditions of existence of others. Different from compulsory power, A cannot necessarily be said to possess the institution that constrains and shapes B. It is certainly possible that a dominant actor maintains total control over an institution, which in turn lords over the other actors. Also, the recognition of the importance of institutional arrangements highlights that A and B are socially removed from one another, spatially. A's action affect the behavior or conditions of others only through institutional arrangements such as decisional rules, formalized lines of responsibility, division of labors, and structures of dependence. Temporally, institutions established at one point in time can have ongoing and unintended effects at a later point through Fulson configuration of privilege. Last but not least, institutional arrangements can shape the agenda-setting process in ways that eliminate those very issues that are points of conflict. Global governance involves formal and informal institutional contexts that dispose that action in directions that advantage some while disadvantage the others. Understanding power in these ways makes it much more difficult to approach global governance purely in terms of cooperation, coordination, consensus, and a normative process. Governance is also a matter of institutional or systematic bias, privilege, and unequal constraints on action. For example, integrating intellectual property into the WTO and therefore institutionalizing it as a matter of policy. Integrating intellectual property into WHO and thereby institutionalizing it as a matter of policy. Integrating HIV/AIDS into the Millennium Development Goals and thereby securing future political attention and funding. Structural power concerns the structures, which means the constitutive internal relations of structural positions that define what kind of social beings actors are. It produces the very social capacities of structural or subject positions in direct relation to one another, and the associated interests that underlie and dispose action. Institutions and structure are defined as sets of rules, procedures, and norms that constrain the action of already constituted actors with fixed preferences. Structure is regarded as a direct constitutive relation, such as structural position A exists only by virtue of its relation to structural position B. Examples include master and slave, as well as capital and labor. Structural power shapes the face and condition of existence of actors in two critical ways. Firstly, structural positions do not generate equal social privileges. Instead, structures allocate differential capacities and typically differential advantages to different positions. Second, the social structure not only constitutes actors and their capacities, it also shapes their self-understanding and subjective interests. Gill and Law in 1989 argued that while power exists in coercion and institutional arrangements, to understand the workings of the global capitalist economy requires a recognition of global production relations as constitutive structure. The structure of global capitalism substantially determines the capacities and resources of actors. World system theorists also draw on the conception of power to the extent that they argue that structures of production generate particular kinds of states identified as core, semi-periphery, and periphery. The positions in the world system generate commensurate sets of identities and interests, and those in the subordinate positions adopt ideologically generated conceptions of interests that support their own domination and the lesser position in that world system. One of the key features of this policy field is that it is highly technical. This structural feature of health policy divides actors that want to influence health policy into two groups, namely experts and laymen. Newis argues that people with a medical background have more influence on health policy making than those without that expertise. Productive power and structural power overlap in several important respects, but they differ in a critical respect. Whereas the former works through direct structural relations, the latter entails more generalized and diffuse social processes. Specifically, structural power is structural constitution, which means production and reproduction of internally related positions of super and subordination or domination that actors occupy. Productive power, however, is the constitution of all social subjects with various social powers through systems of knowledge and discursive practices of broad and general social scope. Conceptually, the move is away from structures per se to systems of signification and meaning, and to networks of social forces perpetually shaping one another. Productive power concerns discourse, the social processes, and the systems of knowledge through which meaning is produced, fixed, lived, experienced, and transformed. Discourses refers to the systems of signification. Discourses are sites of social relations of power because they situate ordinary practices of life and define the social fields of action that are imaginable and possible. Discursive processes and practices produce social identities and capacities as they give meaning to them. Humans are not only power's intended targets, but also its effects. Productive power concerns the boundaries of all social identity, and the capacity and inclination for action of the socially advantaged and disadvantaged alike, as well as the myriad social subjects that are not constituted in binary hierarchical relationships. The magnitude of the AIDS crisis has drawn attention to the fact that millions of people in the developing world do not have access to the medicines they need to treat disease or alleviate suffering. The high cost of AIDS medicines has focused attention on the relationship between patent protection and high drug prices. The difficulties developing countries experience in paying for new essential medicines has raised concerns about the effects of the 1994 World Trade Organization Agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, in short form, TRIPS, which mandates global minimum standards for the protection of intellectual property. Most significantly, the TRIPS agreement harmonized patent terms for a minimum of 20 years and mandated the granting of patents in all fields of technology. This requirement made it no longer possible to exclude medicines and food from patenting. The full implications of TRIPS agreement for health are just beginning to emerge, but will only become fully apparent in the years to come. All new health products, including drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, are likely to be affected by the new TRIPS-based patent regime. The fourth WTO Ministerial Conference held in 2001 in Doha, Qatar, responded to these concerns by adopting the Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health. The Doha Declaration, as it is widely known, affirmed the sovereign right of governments to take measures to protect public health, including the use of compulsory licensing and parallel importation. It also allows least developed countries not to grant or enforce pharmaceutical product patents until at least 2016. These measures have become known as TRIPS flexibilities. A key issue that remained unresolved in Doha was now to ensure the products manufactured under a compulsory license could be exported to countries without domestic production capacity. It took 2 years of difficult negotiations at the WTO to arrive at the August 30th decision, which established a cumbersome process to allow such export to date. It has been used only one country. The Doha Declaration also did not address the as yet unfulfilled promises of increased R&D in exchange for higher levels of IP protection, an expectation that was part of the bargain when countries were negotiating the TRIPS agreement. Nevertheless, the Doha Declaration is one of the most significant developments of the last decade in trade and health. It signaled a sea change in thinking about patents and medicines, and is at the root of a cascade of activities aimed at reformulating intellectual property protection as a social policy for the benefit of society as a whole, rather than a mechanism to protect the only limited commercial interests. Why was IP introduced in rural grey Rang? As research-based pharma expanded into developing markets in the 1970s and 80s, it found copies of medicine being made locally. The state put the issue on the agenda at Uruguay. The negotiations led to the agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights. They established for the first time internationally binding minimum standards for IP protection. Many states oppose this, but they are not powerful enough within the forums to make an impact. What is the impact of pharma IP being negotiated at the WTO? Representatives of health ministries and other groups representing public health interests, such as NGOs, are usually not heard in WTO negotiations. Also, in this forum, the largest and more profitable markets for companies are high-income countries. They vary ones with a lot of influence at the WTO. They use this influence to leverage low and middle-income countries into accepting policies that they have a negative impact on public health. The reason this happens is that low and middle-income countries face a trade-off between improving their prospects for international trade and on protecting health in their countries. What is the impact of pharma IP being negotiated at the WHO? State representatives at the WHO are usually delegates from the national ministries of health. This means their main mandate is to protect health in their countries. They therefore look at IP protection in a different light to their colleagues in economic ministries. From a public health perspective, the benefits of strong IP protections are not clear, and the potential disadvantage is more obvious. Compulsory power, which cover forms of interaction that allow one actor to have direct control over another, and at the extreme force them to do something they would not otherwise do. An obvious example of this is military power. Institutional power, which covers the more indirect control of one actor over another through the design of international institutions that work in their favor at the expense of others. This would encompass political power. Structural power, which concerns the overall constitution of actor roles, such as the designation within the capitalist world economy of social positions for capital and labor. This framework for structuring actors thus confers differential abilities to alter their circumstances and fortunes. This would be consistent with a form of ideological power. That means socialist systems as alternatives to capitalism. Productive power, which concerns the extent to which one actor is able to exert control over another through the possession, use, and distribution of resources and access. This is consistent with economic power, where those with more productive power have a greater freedom to exploit others in order to generate some form of market distortion to their own benefit. This is the end of the session.